Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Professor Jonathan Webster. So we are happy to be in the fourth day of the SFLIG 2023 conference. For this session, we're honored to have Professor Webster to deliver the plenary speech for today. This will be a pre-recorded session, but we are also honored to have Professor Webster here to take the questions after the presentation. So allow me to quickly introduce Professor Webster. Professor Webster is Honorary Professor at Macquarie University and Professor at the City University of Hong Kong. He was the Director of the Halliday Center for Intelligent Applications for Language Studies and Head of Department of Chinese, Translation and Linguistics, City University of Hong Kong from 2015 to 2011. Professor Jonathan Webster is the founding editor for Linguistics and Human Sciences published by Equinox and managing editor for Word. Professor Jonathan Webster is also the editor of 36 books on topics in systemic functional linguistics. So today, we will have Jonathan's talk on speaking of change, theories to live by. So now I will share the video right now.
Speaking of change, let's begin by talking about language change. As Halliday points out, in that language changes. Language, and every particular language, changes and has a history. Halliday identifies three distinct histories: language as a system, language as evolving, the individual speaker, language as developing, the individual's development of a meaning potential. And each instance of language itself has a history, language as unfolding. Halliday's distinction between, on the one hand, language as a system, and on the other hand, each instance of language, can be compared with Saussure's langue and parole. Halliday sees both langue, language as system, and parole, language as instance, as two poles at either end of the cline of instantiation. And to help us understand what he means by instantiation, Halliday gives the analogy of climate and weather. Climate is a generalization made over time, while weather is what occurs at a particular point in time. Nevertheless, both clearly refer to the same phenomenon. And just as climate may be thought of as a theory, a hypothesis about the weather, so too the system of meaning potential is a theory of the text. Besides instantiation, there is also realization. What is displayed on the screen is Ruqaiya Hasan's adaptation of Halliday's graphical representation of instantiation, shown as a horizontal line, and realization, shown as a vertical line. Language as system, langue, is realized in society, and language as instance, parole, is realized in context of situation. Hasan writes this: nothing enters the system of language, the langue, except through the working of parole in meeting the realizational demands in the construal of meanings relevant to some context of situation. And what happens in parole is relevant to the evolution of the resources of the language system. The system of language evolves, and it evolves because of what happens in parole as realized in context of situation. Now, what does context of situation refer to? Malinowski used the expression context of situation. He was the first one to use that expression, but as Halliday points out, it was J.R. Firth, Malinowski's younger colleague and Halliday's mentor, who saw the possibility of integrating this notion of the situation as a kind of context into a general theory. Firth sought to relate what actually occurs in language to a set of options specific to a given environment. Halliday reinterpreted the Malinowski-Firth concept of context of situation in terms of three concepts: field, tenor, and mode. Field, what is being talked about, the ideational metafunction. Tenor, who is talking to whom, the interpersonal metafunction. And how is the activity taking place? Mode, the textual. Hassan writes this: how the speaker perceives the situation in terms of field, tenor, and mode activates the choice of certain meanings which are realized by her choice of wordings. She continues, these meaning word choices activated by context of situation form an instance of some registral variety whose correlate is some specific category of context. One could easily get the idea that realization between language and society, between text and context, goes one way. But in fact, however, while context certainly affects the way we speak, it is also true that the way we speak affects how we perceive the context of situation. See, realization runs both ways. Realization represents the chicken-egg-like relationship of causality between society and language, between context of situation and text. Our speaking not only changes the way we perceive the context of situation, what we say can also change society. Hassan argues for a reciprocity between language and society. She writes this: our experience of how things work in language as it functions in real life runs counter to such linear explanations. We know, or at least we ought to know, that everywhere, at every stage of human history, preachers and politicians have persuaded and are persuading their listeners purely through discourse to support some line of action which is designed to bring change in society. She continues, obviously, such preaching has to precede the social action and its outcome. This makes nonsense of the linear causal explanation. To insist on such causal linearity is to underestimate the power of language in shaping human beings and their universe. The relationship between language and society is reciprocal and dynamic, each feeding back into the other. Now, usually when we think of language evolving, we think of it in terms of either phonological or lexicogrammatical features. But then, as Halliday points out, the structures, the words, the sounds are in fact the realization of meaning potential. So Halliday asks whether we should be considering the evolution of the meaning potential of languages. And since meaning potential is associated with the social functions of language, what we are seeing is the evolution of functional meaning potential. Now, when Halliday talks about functional meaning potential, we can see the influence of the Prague School focus on functions as uses of language. The study of language functions by Karl Bühler, a German linguist and psychologist, was influential in the development of functionalism in the Prague School tradition. Now, Bühler identified three functions in language: the expressive function, language oriented to the speaker; the conative function, language oriented to the addressee; and the representational, language oriented to everything else. Halliday, when comparing his metafunctional approach to Buhler's, writes this: "My own ideational corresponds very closely to Buhler's representational, except that I want to introduce the further distinction between experiential and logical, which corresponds to a fundamental distinction within language itself." Halliday's interpersonal metafunction is a combination of Buhler's conative and expressive. However, Halliday uniquely added a third metafunction: the textual metafunction. The textual function is not mentioned by Malinowski or Buhler or anyone else. Halliday argues that the textual metafunction is intrinsic to language. To quote Halliday, "It is the function that language has of creating text, of relating itself to the context, to the situation, and the preceding text." Consider for a moment how recent changes in the way we communicate may have affected our functional meaning potential. Let me ask you this question. Would you say that texting is a good thing or a bad thing? John McWhorter from Columbia University in New York disagrees with those who claim that texting will lead to the decline and fall of writing ability among young people. Instead, he describes texting as a miraculous thing, a new kind of language with a new structure.
There are always people worrying about these things, and the planet somehow seems to keep spinning. And so, the way I'm thinking of texting these days is that what we're seeing is a whole new way of writing that young people are developing, which they're using alongside their ordinary writing skills. And that means that they're able to do two things. Increasing evidence is that being bilingual is cognitively beneficial. That's also true of being bidialectal. That's certainly true of being bidialectal in terms of your writing. And so texting actually is evidence of a balancing act that young people are using today. Not consciously, of course, but it's an expansion of their linguistic repertoire.
In a paper Halliday presented at the 37th International Systemic Functional Congress at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, he offers a very different perspective on the impact of recent technological advances on our functional meaning potential. Halliday commented this. He said, "Even within one language, we can see new patterns in the integration of the metafunctions, with meanings now often packaged as a succession of bite-sized chunks to accommodate the reduced space on a small screen and the reduced time scale of much of today's interaction, and perhaps the reduced attention span of the interactants." He continues, "Here, both interpersonal and textual meanings take on a new prominence, though for different reasons. The textual, in integrating the various semiotic strands, with the interesting consequence that it becomes less explicit in the text, rather like the subtitles in a foreign language movie. The interpersonal, on the other hand, becoming more explicit as the exchange of meaning becomes increasingly individualized and personalized." He goes on to give this example: "We are never shown parliamentary debates on our television screens, only the ranting and swapping of abuses that are thought to make good television." Halliday goes so far as to argue that by reducing discourse to a succession of bite-sized chunks, we run the risk of destroying knowledge.
Now here, of course, you can hear the interpersonal component intruding into my own text, because it is clear that I don't like to find so much of meaning reduced to a series of bite-sized chunks. And I don't like the way that any thoughtful discourse by those we have elected to govern us is overtaken by verbal brawling. And I blame the media for it. You can hear the scare quotes just now when I referred to good television. Now, okay, this is just one small symptom, not in itself important, but then we are told that symptoms never are. I'm doubtful about this. But it is symptomatic of a process that I talked about somewhere else as the destruction of knowledge. A destruction of knowledge which, as an old-fashioned socialist and lifelong Marxist, I see as part of the death throes of what is now corporate capitalism. Capitalism is a socio-political structure that was spectacularly successful when it first evolved. Why? Because its controls evolved along with it. But it has now passed its use-by date, and it has moved on, as most structures do. I'm saying this because it's a general property of structures, that they move on from being enabling to being constraining, and in this case may destroy anything in its ruthless determination to survive. Okay, but what is happening to knowledge is perhaps not so much its destruction in absolute terms, but its polarization. The increasing gap in our societies between the knows and the don't knows, replacing the old haves and the have-nots. That's become a worldwide phenomenon, inter rather than intra-societal. Yeah. Either way, of course, it's destructive.
Whether or not one accepts Halliday's argument that we are seeing the destruction of knowledge, one cannot ignore the obvious increase in polarization resulting from our unwillingness, or perhaps even inability, to communicate beyond bite-sized chunks. Not only is society changing, but so too is our functional meaning potential. If we rely less and less on the resources for expressing textual meaning, and instead prioritize the interpersonal, what impact will this subsequently have on our potential for making textual meaning? Is our potential for making textual meaning shrinking? One cannot overstate the significance, however, of textual meaning to our very existence as human beings living in society. The textual metafunction is critically important to giving us our theories to live by. There is a tendency, I think, to treat the ideational and interpersonal as core metafunctions, and the textual as something almost like a third wheel, providing only peripheral support to the other two. But the textual is not just some third wheel metafunction. And textual meaning is realized by more than just thematic and information structures at the clause level. Beyond clause level, there is a patterning of choices across the text that contributes to a text's cohesiveness and coherence. Early on, a child develops the ability to create text. And Halliday describes that text as a parallel virtual universe that is made of meaning and that has its own structure as metaphor for the structures it is imposing on the material world. Now, what does Halliday mean when he describes a text as having its own structure as metaphor for the structures it is imposing on the material world? We tell stories. We theorize about the world, and we do so by means of the metaphor-making potential of text. Russell Mears, Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Sydney, in his book entitled Borderline Personality Disorder and the Conversational Model, a Clinician's Manual, Russell Mears likens the stories that we create to a metaphoric cinematic screen on which is portrayed a partially glimpsed personal reality. My sense of the reality around and inside me is captured metaphorically and projected verbally through my text. It is through the metaphoric text that I portray my partially glimpsed personal reality. In his paper on Matter and Meaning, the Two Realms of Human Experience, Halliday wrote this. He said, "Every theory is a metaphor for what it is theorizing. Our theories are told through our texts." In an address at the University of Hong Kong in 2004, Halliday refers to the relationship between grammar and discourse as an illustration of the knight's move. Like in the game of Western-style chess, the knight's move illustrates what Halliday describes as a non-linear step in the development of higher orders of discourse construction. The metafunctional organization of language actualizes this sidestep into the metaphorical making potential of discourse text. Russell Mears, in another of his books, The Poet's Voice and the Making of Mind, he writes this: "The evolutionary trajectory of Homo sapiens was towards the ability to construct a story, the prologue to which is necessarily a proto-language that involves the use of symbols, that is, metaphor." He continues, "The crucial narrative which Homo sapiens evolved and that gave it an evolutional advantage was not any kind of story. It had the structure of myth, depending upon the coordination of two forms of language and modes of thought, which have different development pathways and neurological bases. One concerns syntactical development, that is, the verbal, and the other symbolic, the mythical. This myth-making potential gives us the theories by which we live. Perhaps we need to rephrase Halliday's statement about every theory being a metaphor to every theory is a myth about that which it is theorizing. To say that something is a myth is not to say that it is necessarily untrue. J.R.R. Tolkien, he's probably most famous for such works as The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. He was part of a small group of writers who met at Oxford, and they were known as the Inklings. And Tolkien acknowledged that inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light. Text as myth. This myth-making potential, this is the non-linear step that defines our humanness, our ability to metaphorize, to articulate symbols, to theorize, to be poetic, sets us apart from other species. To illustrate our myth-making potential, I will look at two examples, one from literature, the second from science. Both speak of change, presenting their theories, their myths. Let me begin by looking at myth-making in verbal art. Myth-making is achieved in verbal art by the way in which the writer mobilizes, by the way that he takes the habitual, typical pattern of grammatical choice, or what Hassan calls the verbalization, and turns it into a patterning which is unique to the text. In other words, a new automatic. The writer artistically creates a new automatic, an automatization against which to de-automatize, creates a background against which to foreground. The writer's aim is to create what Hassan calls a theme, which, as she explains, is a hypothesis about some aspect of the life of social man. The theme is the writer's hypothesis, the writer's theory, and this theme or theory is the artist's myth. Edwin Thumboo, Emeritus Professor of English Literature at the National University of Singapore, has been called the father of English language poetry in Singapore. Edwin wrote the poem Language as Power for L&B for two of his closest friends, Larry Smith and Braj Khatru, the L&B. And both Larry Smith and Braj Khatru are well known for having pioneered the now well-established field of world Englishes. Braj Khatru is probably best known for his three-circle model of world Englishes. Khatru's three concentric circles illustrate the expansion of English worldwide. The inner circle includes what are traditionally the native speaker varieties. The outer circle includes the transplanted varieties of English in countries typically with a colonial past. The expanding circle includes regions where English is learned primarily as a foreign language. Edwin Thumboo has been writing poetry in English over both the colonial and post-colonial periods of Singapore's history. He writes out of and then against the formative influences with which he's familiar. Khatru describes Edwin Thumboo as employing various stylistic devices as a linguistic weapon to change the colonial language and to give it a new identity. A new identity is necessary to preserve one's own unique cultural, national identity against the leveling power of a globalized language like English.
Language, identity, very important. And I'm glad to see that identity is now becoming another, is making a comeback. And it has to, because as you globalize, if you don't have a strong sense of identity, you get absorbed, you get leveled.
Edwin credits language with playing an important role in how he looks at both literature and life. He describes his poetry-making technique as involving the chiseling of language, the rearranging of language, the sound, the rhythm, the tautness, the layering. Edwin's poem, Language as Power, divides into two movements, each with three stanzas. The opening line of the first movement, "The beginning was the Word, God," echoes the opening verse of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The poem begins almost hymn-like in alliterative verse, reverently celebrating the sacredness, wonder, beauty of the Word as it traveled, tilted, soared into new habitations, new heritages. One can't help but feel the poet's deep sense of awe at the beauty and wonder of perfect seasons in the land, the adjectival poise of mountain, sea, and plain, songs, unfolding fragrances, lush, humming islands. Through these lines, Edwin is relating to his friends, Larry and Braj, and also to us as readers on both aesthetic and spiritual levels. Humanity joins in a seamless chant that binds three famous couples, which he names Rama Sita from Hindu culture, Adam and Eve from Judeo-Christian tradition, and Kukonyo Mumbi from African literature, whose redeeming myths still numinate, render precise the march of history. These three famous couples are cultural icons that represent unique cultural and national traditions that belong within the expanding canons of the English language. The second movement stands in sharp contrast to the inspiring picture painted by the poet in the first movement. The power and wonder of language, which is so powerfully projected in the first movement, is portrayed here in the second movement as diminished, corrupted. Along with the historic beginnings of speech communities, rise of empires, and subsequent expansion of English worldwide have come the stirrings of tribal assertiveness and linguistic chauvinism. No longer real power. Instead, the power of language has become only the play of words, or, as the poet describes it, neo-power. Language has been co-opted into a contest for power as assertive tribes insinuate authority. In this stanza, Cottrew's three circles likely inspired the textual pattern of three lexicogrammatically parallel items in a series that Edwin includes here. Just a few examples: natal semantic loads, empires, Cottreu circles. Insinuate authority, invent command, extend language into power. TEFL, TESL, TG. Ways of discourse, metafiction, streams of specialists, hypothesized, quarreled, exported heresies. Streams of specialists export deliberately misleading myths, their heresies, about world Englishes. In his paper, entitled The Past and Prejudice Toward Demythologizing the English Canon, Cottreu argues against four what he calls consciously cultivated myths about world Englishes. The interlocutor myth, the idea that English is learned primarily in order to interact with native speakers of English. The monocultural myth, English serves only to promote the Judeo-Christian tradition. The interlanguage myth, non-native speakers fall short of their goal of speaking English like a native. And the Cassandra myth, diversification of English is an indicator of decay and division. In contrast to these false myths with no redeeming value, Cottreu's myth of world Englishes is a redeeming myth, whose redeeming qualities of realism and respect for non-native varieties of English is captured in the final stanza of Edwin's Language is Power. In the final stanza of the poem, Edwin celebrates the power of language to adapt, daffodils mutate, and accommodate a plurality of perspectives, defining room for mutual fresh realities. The word fresh is repeated twice: fresh vocabulary, fresh realities. Edwin Tumbu's Language is Power reflects his own experience of coming out of a colonial past and then confronting the chauvinistic claims of those who would resist change and deny others the opportunity to make the language their own. Edwin Tumbu lived Braj Cottreu's redeeming myth. But there's also myth-making in verbal science. In the language of science, Halliday observed a steady drift in the direction of nominalizing grammar. Things are foregrounded at the expense of qualities, processes, relations. These shifts away from the congruent through what Halliday calls grammatical metaphor reoccur with such an intensity that the shifts eventually drift in the direction of a new automatic in verbal science. The effect of this nominalizing grammar is that it has given scientists enormous power over their environment, so much so that they can make the world stand still or even create new virtual realities. Paradoxically, the more abstract the theorizing, the more concrete the world becomes. We see the world through the lens of the scientist's myth. The grammatical metaphor is not the only means of myth-making in verbal science. Other textual resources are also available to scientists to tell their story. This is well illustrated in Halliday's analysis of Darwin's The Origin of Species. Halliday was fascinated by Darwin's The Origin of Species, and in particular the final paragraphs, which conclude with what Halliday describes as its resounding climax. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful, most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Halliday comments this. He says, this resounding lexicogrammatical cadence brings the clause, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter in the book to a crashing conclusion with a momentum to which I can think of no parallel elsewhere in literature. Perhaps only Beethoven has produced comparable effects, and that in another medium altogether. Halliday writes, I do not know how long it took Darwin to compose these two paragraphs, or whether he reflected consciously on their construction as he was doing it. I imagine not. I certainly had no idea when starting the analysis of what I was going to find. Halliday continues, I had the sense of a remarkable, powerful piece of writing as the climax to a remarkable and powerful book, and it struck me that something of the effect of these two paragraphs might lie in the patterning of the theme and of the new. That is, in the textual component within the grammar of the clause. This table shows how Darwin's choices of theme and new unfold throughout the final two paragraphs. They indicate the threads which cohesively bind the text together. Appearing as theme throughout the final two paragraphs are what Halliday identifies, what he labels as authorities, the phenomena of species, and so on. Appearing as new information are expressions of explanation, the process of evolution, etc. Through his analysis, Halliday demonstrated how the last paragraph brings together all these threads into one concluding clause. There is grandeur in this view of life. It captures the expressions of ennoblement which are included in new information, with its several powers, from life forms and endowments occurring as theme, having been originally breathed into from transmission and procreation as new, a few forms or into one, from inhabitants and groups appearing as theme, whilst this planet has gone cycling on from time, past, future as new, according to the fixed law of gravity from law, natural selection, under new, from so simple a beginning, from sources, law, war of nature as theme, endless forms, from variation as theme, most beautiful and most wonderful, again from ennoblement as new information. All the ideas that Darwin threaded throughout the text are reunited here, brought together here in the concluding sentence. And Halliday also observes how phonologically the coordination of that have been and are being forces a break in the rhythm, which is further reinforced by the surrounding commas. And this break in the rhythm directs, as Halliday puts it, maximum body weight on that final word, evolved. This is verbal science at its most remarkable and powerful. To quote Halliday, Darwin's The Origin of Species is a product of the impact between an intellectual giant and a moment in the space-time continuum of our culture, with all the complexity of meaning that implies. The key to innovation in verbal science, creativity in verbal art, is symbolic articulation. This ability to articulate symbols, metaphors, can be summed up in what Halliday calls de-automatization. And what is de-automatization? What is de-automatization? The term comes from Mukarovsky. It refers to the partial freeing of the lower level systems, the lexicogrammar, the phonology, from the control of the semantics. In verbal science, de-automatization is illustrated by a grammatical metaphor. processes, instead of being realized by verbs, are now realized grammatically by nouns. In verbal art, de-automatization is illustrated by the way the poet foregrounds against the background of a pattern of grammatical choice unique to the text. Now, while both grammatical metaphor and foregrounding obviously illustrate de-automatization, we should keep an open mind about the full extent of our potential for turning the literal into the metaphorical. And this metaphor-making potential provides the means for articulating the imagination of the poet and the scientist, turning whatever they imagine into the myths by which we live. Halliday wrote this. He said, in some ways, scientific text, perhaps what we might call verbal science, by analogy with verbal art, does resemble literature. There is an analogous level of interpretation, a double articulation within the semantics. It is not that of symbolic articulation with theme, which is what Hassan called it in referring to verbal art, but that of symbolic articulation with theory. He continues, verbal art, verbal science are both dedicated to the more abstract construal of human experience, but they pursue it by different routes, different strategies of thinking, out of those evolved by the human brain. And the two currents of thought have not infrequently merged with one another during the known history of human discourse. And toward the end of their lives, Halliday and Hassan were collaborating on a book showing how grammatical metaphor and verbal science, foregrounding and verbal art, were really one phenomenon, which they call de-automatization, involving the realignment of the connections between the upper strata of meaning and the strata below of lexicogrammar, what Halliday refers to as the Knight's move in language. Now, speaking of change in language and society, whether through verbal art or verbal science, it relies on the meaning-making resources available in language for, as to borrow the poet's words, translating psyches, achieving metaphors, defining room for mutual, fresh realities.
Thank you so much, Professor Webster, for your very powerful presentation, very powerful speech. So welcome everyone again. So please give your warmest welcome, your biggest applause to Professor Webster, please. Now we have a few minutes for Q&A. So if you have any thoughts, any questions, please feel free to turn on your microphones or your cameras. So the floor is open.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Professor John. That was an insightful presentation. Well done, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you.
I so much enjoyed it. The aspect of the verbal arts. And I could see some element of stylistic analysis being brought on ground to unfold systemic functional linguistics. Well done, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I've got a question, but it's just a very simple question about students learning, for example. In Hong Kong, I don't think there are lots of students who would have the opportunity to appreciate literature at school. So basically, most of them will have to, proactively opt for literature classes or literature courses in order to appreciate art. But now it seems that with linguistics, or in particular text linguistics, that we are, so engaged with or engaged in. So, do you have any suggestions for our students nowadays to appreciate art with the use of verbal science or linguistics? So, Professor.
Yeah, I know myself when uh, before I became more familiar with poetry and, for example, when I looked at Edwin Tumbu's poetry, it really was enlightening to me because what I began to see was the way in which the poet is very deliberately using the resources of language. And SFL gives us a way to be able to handle that and be able to describe that and to get into the text and see what the poet is doing. I think for many people, when they approach poetry to begin with, they think it's just a nice way to express ideas in colorful language, and they don't see what is behind it. They don't see that layering. They don't see the way in which the poet has been able to master the resources of language and the ways in which language is working to produce a meaningful, what Hassan is calling the theme. What we really see is the artist's myth. There really is a meaning there, and that can be captured when we approach it through, like SFL, looking at it in terms of the various kinds of meaning. It's been enlightening to me when I've now looked at poetry from that point of view. And I think if we can get that across to students, that they can actually see that there's an art there, there's a craft there that can really impress them. And they can see, oh, yes. And, when I've looked at Edwin's poetry, that was not the only poem. I've looked at others as well. And there's a lot in them that's going on there. And I've done an analysis and published analyses of his poetry. And one time I asked him about a particular poem. I said, did I get what you were trying to do in that poem? And he replied, some of it. In other words, there's a whole lot that's going on in the poem. That's really what makes the poet an artist. The craft that is there, that and the more you dig into it, the more you discover. And it's that discovery that makes it so interesting and so vital and so appealing.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Webster. And I indeed benefited a lot from your general education course that you ran during your service at CDU. So we have a few questions. Yeah, we have a question in the chat room. So I'd love to ask your opinion on how Halliday's approach works in students' preparation for today's standardized English test, for example, IELTS. So how can test prep teachers embed SFL in classes to improve students' performance in academic writing, for instance? So thank you for your great presentation and your answers.
I think one of the ways in which, especially for IELTS writing, is the overall textual structure. And when we approach the text in terms of the various aspects of textual meaning that are realized through the grammar, we make students realize that there is an overall structure there. There is a coherence. And how can they achieve greater cohesion, greater coherence within the text? That would really improve, I think, their performance in like on an IELTS examination. It's what are the resources that we can identify, that have been identified in systemic functional linguistics, like that are also complementary theories like rhetorical structure theory, that enable students to get a better appreciation of how their text has a structure, needs to have a structure in order to be able to get a better response from the reader.
Indeed. That's also what I mentioned to my students. The first thing that you should achieve is to, have an effective organization of your text before you think about something else. The easiest way to approach. Okay, so yeah, we have a few comments. In the same, so we have Kai. In the same vein with Ms. Owen's question, I use analysis of thematic progression and cohesive devices to teach EFL writing. So it's one of the most approachable ways to, help students organize their text. So would you like to add anything, Professor Webster?
Yeah, I would recommend anyone who's interested, especially in looking at the coherent structuring of a text, look at rhetorical structure theory, and specifically, what are the use of conjunctions? How are the relations that are expressed through writing? How are they realized through the grammar? And thematic progression is one aspect, cohesive devices another. But what are the other aspects that allow for the more coherent structuring and getting across that message? I think that would be very helpful. I recommend looking at rhetorical structure theory, and especially how are those rhetorical relations realized through the grammar.
Right, thank you. So Laura Plavaka had a question. So could you tell us what the title of the book Hassan and Halliday were working on relating to the automatization in language? Is it available? Where can we learn more about work on the automatization in language?
After Professor Hassan passed away, I was visiting Professor Halliday in Sydney. He was telling me about their plan of doing this collaborative work together, and he felt that it wasn't something that he could continue himself. At the time, he was quite physically, he was quite ill, and so he asked me and David Butt from Macquarie University to continue that work. And so now David and myself are working on the book that Professors Halliday and Hassan were originally planning to do themselves. And he's given us notes that he had made about what he was looking forward to doing in the book. And so it's been it's been a very inspirational task to continue this work. We are presently working on it, and it's not yet completed. And please look forward to it in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Prof.
we are inspired a lot, immensely by you. So you can also see the very warm comments and thoughts from the chat room, saying gratitude and so on.
Well, thank you everyone for sticking through it, for listening, and I think this is something that I hope we can get across to our students, the importance of the textual metafunction and realizing those resources to make our ideas known, and how we can appreciate how others have made their ideas known through their texts. So thank you for your attention.
So, Professor Jonathan Webster, concerning the project, are you planning to get a kind of a set of people who could work with you to develop that aspect? I mean,
yes, certainly. I mean, been very it's been very helpful to have others working alongside me during these years. And I look forward to anyone who's interested to collaborate on this. Would love to work with them.
Yeah,
Perhaps
because
you're interested, Peter.
yeah, I did something sometimes ago on a SFLIG on using SFL as a resource for meaning making. I analyzed a poem by
Oh, really?
yeah, I did something on that. So because of my passion for stylistics, what I have discovered is this: for you to be able to work on this, you must first of all have passion for stylistics analysis for poem. And
Yeah,
people
yeah,
see literature as something difficult, complex to handle. So they are scared about dabbling into literature, not to talk of you looking at it from a linguistic perspective. So I think the first thing is about interest, passion, and then learning on the job. So I see literature, poetry, I mean, the linguistic aspect as resources for making meaning. And there are a lot of things that you can draw from that. Well, in my own literature statistics class, I'm teaching a third year student statistics analysis. So I try to incorporate a bit of SFL, although the course is not being taught in my university, but I'm trying to incorporate it to make them to see what a lot of signifier and signify metaphorical representation that we have in literary work and their embedded meaning. So that is one thing. The student must have interest in this area and then be enlightened more. And I think with the project of nature, people can be enlightened because it is really an interesting thing. You see a lot of metaphorical expression where you can bring out meaning. I mean, see them as meaning potentials, which many people are not aware of. When we talk about anaphoric and cataphoric references within the text, just as you have pointed out, the way you segment everything and brought everything online. So I'll be happy if you can make the program open for people like us to contribute.
Well, I'd love to, Peter. The invitation's there. Please pass along what you've done. I'd love to read it and see what you've done in your own analysis of poetry.
Okay. I will get your email from Vin and forward the PowerPoint to you. I'm trying to see how to develop it. I've been busy, so I've not been able to expand it. I brought in a bit of Azan's verbal arts, but I'm now looking at it from different perspectives. Or also try to bring in the visual as verbal art.
Well, of course,
visual
yes.
element, the imagery.
Oh, yes.
The use of imagery which evoke memories, remembrance, and then when you have the picture, and then you talk about the verbal art of it. So I try to do something like that. The phonological aspect of it as well. I mean, all those literary terms, you turning them to linguistic elements, many making potentials. So I would love to share that.
Okay, and I'll share some work that I've done on, especially on Edwin Tumbu's poetry. That also, it's striking how he doesn't just create verbal metaphors; he creates visual metaphors through his poetry. So we can share our ideas later. Look forward to it.
Okay, that would be great.
Okay,
fantastic, fantastic. So everyone, please give another round of applause for Professor Jonathan Webster. So I think that's it so far. So if we have other questions, please feel free to contact us and perhaps contact Professor Webster. So we now will have a lunch break. Are there any updates, Vin, on today's schedule?
Yeah, I just sent you one minor update for today. So the session manner which were originally scheduled on Monday, and he couldn't do due to technical issue. So she's going to present in my session 1C. So the first one. So that's the only change for today. Everything is the same. And we will have lunch for OC people, and for other people, you have a break for 1 hour, 15 minutes, and we will come back at 1:15 a.m. Hobart time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll have to run. I'll see you guys in 1:50.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan, and
Thank you.
thank you everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.
Enjoy your lunch.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Vin, how many hours break do we have? Yeah, how many hours break do we have?
It's your you need to go to bed, right? It's 2 p.m. right? 2 a.m. Are you going to Peter? No, you are not presenting today, right? No.
No, I'm not presenting.
Okay, that's good.
Okay. So we have about 2 hours.
We will come back as 1:15 Hobart time.
Okay.
I will put a message in the chat spot now.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
See you later.
Yeah, see you.
Hi Emma, it's good to see you.
Hi, Vin. Thank you for that. That was fabulous.
Okay, it's good. It's good to see you finally in one session.
Yeah.
Really busy with marking, right? Have you finished
Yeah.
all the marking?
Yeah, finished all the marking. Actually gave a presentation yesterday that I was working on, and I've seen some of Jonathan's slides. It's so good to address some of the questions that people had. So anyway, I'll let you go, Vin, but we just appreciate the work you're all doing. It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you for saying that. It's a pleasure. Thank you and see you again soon. Bye bye, Emma.